Bougainville, Solomon Islands, November 8, 1943. The rain falls as if it harbors a grudge. Not the light afternoon rain of summer, but an overwhelming wall of water that turns the forest floor into a river of mud, each breath feeling like suffocation. Captain Robert Chen of the United States Marine Corps stands in a clearing with no path, just between the trees. Here, there are fewer things trying to kill you. The Thompson submachine gun in his hand is 20 pounds heavier than it was 6 hours earlier at dawn, but feels like 6 years. Behind him, 12 Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Division, wait with the patient weariness of men who have learned that complaining wastes energy they don't have. They've been in Bougainville for 14 days. They've walked the same patrol route 11 times. They've seen nothing but the forest, the rain, and occasionally a python as thick as a man's thigh. Chen doesn't know it yet, but he stands 147 meters away from the largest Japanese underground supply depot in the Solomon Islands. He's passed by it 11 times. He'll pass by it 37 more times before anyone notices. This isn't a story of clumsiness. This is a story of how terribly good Japanese military engineers became at completely obliterating massive military installations. Before we delve deeper into this story, you need to understand what Bougainville was in 1943. It wasn't just another island. It was a fortress. The Japanese had been there since 1942, and they had used every day to dig, to build, to transform this jungle into something that could spill the Americans' blood if they weren't careful. The island is about 120 miles long and 30 miles wide at its widest point. The interior is dominated by 2 volcanic mountain ranges, both over 8,000 feet high, named by the Japanese the Crown Prince Range and the Emperor Range. Between these mountains lies some of the densest, wetter, and most hostile forests in the Pacific. The trees grow so densely that in some places you can't see the sky. The leaves are so thick that when it rains, which it always does, the water doesn't reach the ground for 5 minutes after it starts falling. It hangs suspended among the leaves, accumulates, and eventually gravity prevails, cascading down in waves. Approximately 40,000 Japanese soldiers were entrenched here, not in the coastal fortifications, not in visible shelters, underground, in tunnels, caves, and facilities carved into the volcanic rock by engineering troops who understood that the only way to escape American artillery and air power was not to be where the Americans thought you were. A Marine landing at Cape Torokina was expected on November 1st, 1943. The Japanese knew the Americans were coming. They had known for weeks. But instead of meeting them on the beaches, they had retreated. They had waited. They had watched from positions the Marines couldn't see, and in some cases would never see, even after the war was over. Captain Chen's patrol mission was simple on paper: a thorough reconnaissance, advance inland from the landing site, map the terrain, locate enemy positions, report back. Don't engage unless you've already engaged. The Marine Corps had learned that searching for combat in the jungle was pointless in places like Guadalcanal. The jungle would provide all the combat you could handle without you having to search. But Chen's patrol found nothing. No enemy positions, no new tracks, no signs of recent activity, just jungle and more jungle, and a silence that suggested the intelligence reports were wrong. Maybe the Japanese had evacuated. Maybe they'd retreated to Rabaul. Maybe this whole operation would be a march. The reality was different. The reality was that every time Chen's patrol walked that path, Japanese soldiers were watching them from hidden observation posts. Every time Chen stopped to check his map, a Japanese sergeant 100 meters away was noting the number of Marines, their equipment, and their direction of travel. When Chen's radio operator returned a report of negative contact to the battalion, this radio transmission was intercepted and translated by Japanese intelligence officers working in chambers carved 15 meters below the forest floor. The facility Chen constantly passed had been designated by the Japanese as the 7th supply point. It had been under construction since March of 1943, an 8-month project. The main tunnel entrance was hidden beneath an artificial hill. It was a massive camouflage net structure built on a bamboo frame and covered with real soil, real plants, and real trees that had been cut down and replanted in the structure. From 50 feet away, it looked like a hill. From 100 feet away, it looked like jungle. From the air, even with American reconnaissance pilots flying as low as they dared, it was invisible. The entrance itself was 15 feet wide and 12 feet high, large enough to drive a truck through. Behind that entrance lay almost 900 feet of tunnels connecting 17 separate chambers. Some were storage rooms stacked with ammunition, medical supplies, and rice. Others were barracks, housing 260 Japanese soldiers. There was a command post with radio equipment. There was an aid station with 10 beds and actual medical instruments. There was even a small room set aside for Buddhist prayer, because the Japanese understood that men who think they might die underground want to make peace with their gods. All of this existed 470 feet from a trail that American Marines walked almost daily for 4 months. The construction technique was brilliant and brutal. The Japanese had used forced labor, local islanders, and prisoners of war to do the initial digging. The volcanic rock was soft enough to excavate with hand tools, but stable enough that it didn't require extensive shoring. The engineering units had carefully removed all the excavated rock and soil, hauling it away at night and dumping it in the ocean. No spoil piles, no evidence of digging, nothing to indicate that thousands of cubic feet of earth had been moved. The ventilation system was equally sophisticated, 17 separate ventilation shafts, each one concealed among the roots of massive trees or disguised as termite mounds. The shafts were positioned to disperse air across a wide area, preventing any concentration of heat or smell that might be detected. The Japanese engineers had even calculated the airflow patterns to ensure that cooking smoke, and there was cooking smoke because the men had to eat, would be dispersed before it reached the jungle canopy where it might be visible. Chen's patrol followed a routine. Leave the beachhead at dawn, move inland for 2 miles, swing north for another mile, loop back, standard reconnaissance pattern. By the 3rd week of November, the Marines had walked that route so many times they knew every tree, every stream crossing, every spot where the mud was particularly bad. On November 24th, something changed. Not in the jungle, in Chen's orders. Battalion wanted them to extend the patrol another mile inland, push deeper, see what was there. Chen gathered his squad leaders that evening. Sergeant Michael Kowalski, a Polish kid from Chicago who could navigate by the stars and hadn't gotten lost since boot camp. Corporal James Red Cloud, a Lakota from South Dakota, who could move through jungle so quietly that Chen had twice ordered him to make more noise because he kept vanishing. And Corporal David Martinez, a Mexican-American from Texas who had a talent for noticing things that didn't belong, the branch that was bent wrong, the rock that was out of place. They studied the map by flashlight in a waterproof tent that leaked anyway. The extension would take them past the current patrol limit, and into terrain they hadn't scouted. Chen told them to be ready for contact, to assume the Japanese were there even if they couldn't see them. What Chen didn't know was that this extension would take his patrol within 200 feet of Supply Point 7's northern perimeter, closer than they had ever been. Close enough that if someone coughed at the wrong moment, they might hear it. The patrol moved out on November 25th at 05:30. 14 Marines this time. Chen had requested 2 extra men after being authorized to go deeper. They moved slowly. Martinez walked point, 20 feet ahead of the main group, eyes scanning for tripwires, punji stakes, any indication that the Japanese had booby-trapped the area. The jungle at this depth was different, darker. The canopy was so thick that the rain wasn't falling. It was dripping, a constant patter that made every sound suspect. The trees were massive, some of them 20 feet around at the base, their roots creating networks of natural trenches that could hide an entire squad. At 07:15, Martinez stopped. Hand up. Freeze. Chen moved forward slowly, weapon ready. Martinez was kneeling at the base of a tree, looking at something on the ground. Chen knelt beside him. It was a cigarette butt. Japanese. The paper was distinctive, rougher than American cigarettes, and the smell was different. But more importantly, it was recent. The paper wasn't soaked through. In this rain, a cigarette left on the ground would be pulp within hours. This one was maybe 6 hours old. Chen felt his heart rate increase. This was the first physical evidence of Japanese presence they had found in 4 weeks. He called Kowalski forward, showed him the cigarette. Kowalski nodded and began scanning the area more carefully. What they found over the next 15 minutes changed everything. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. 3 more cigarette butts within a 30-foot radius. A broken branch that looked like someone had stepped on it. A faint depression in the mud that might have been a footprint, but was too degraded to be certain. Someone had been here recently, multiple someones, and they had been standing still long enough to smoke cigarettes, not moving through, not passing by, standing, watching. Chen made the call to battalion, reported possible enemy observation post in the area. Battalion told him to mark the location and continue the patrol. Do not investigate further without support. Chen had Red Cloud climb a tree and tie a strip of orange cloth high enough to be seen by friendlies, but hopefully not by anyone on the ground. Then the patrol moved on, extending their route as ordered. They walked within 180 feet of Supply Point 7's main entrance. They didn't see it. They couldn't see it. But the Japanese observers inside Supply Point 7 saw them, watched them through carefully concealed observation slits, tracked their movement, noted the time they passed and the direction they were heading. The Japanese commander of Supply Point 7, a Major Takeshi Yamamoto, made an entry in his log that evening. He noted that American patrols were extending their range. He noted that they had found cigarette butts left by a careless sentry, and he noted that the sentry would be disciplined. But he also noted that the Americans had walked past the facility again without detecting it. The camouflage was holding. What Yamamoto didn't write in his log, but what he thought about as he sat in his underground command post, was how long this could continue. The Americans were persistent. They would keep coming. They would keep looking. Eventually they would find something. A ventilation shaft, a track that led somewhere it shouldn't. Some small error that would unravel the entire concealment. The question was when. Chen's patrol returned to base at 1400 hours. He filed his report with battalion intelligence. The cigarette butts were logged as evidence of enemy activity. The area was marked for further investigation. But investigation required resources, and resources were allocated based on priority. The beachhead was still being expanded. Defensive positions were still being built. Artillery was still being hauled ashore. A few cigarette butts in the jungle didn't constitute an immediate threat. So the patrols continued. Chen's squad walked that route again on November 27th, November 29th, December 2nd, December 5th. Each time they extended slightly further. Each time they found small things. Another cigarette butt. A piece of cloth that looked like it came from a Japanese uniform. Once they found a rice ball wrapped in leaves, still relatively fresh, which meant someone was eating out here recently. But they never found the installation. They walked past it 48 times over the course of 4 months. 48 times. The Marines weren't incompetent. They were fighting an enemy that had perfected the art of underground warfare. The Japanese had learned lessons from every campaign, from China, from Manchuria, from their earlier Pacific operations. They had refined their techniques to the point where they could hide entire battalions in plain sight. But no concealment is perfect. No deception lasts forever. And in late February of 1944, Supply Point 7 made its first serious mistake. The mistake wasn't dramatic. It was logistical. The installation had been designed to support 260 men for 6 months without resupply. By February, they'd been occupied for nearly 5 months. Food was running low, medical supplies were depleted, and most critically, they were running out of cigarettes. Nicotine addiction seems like a small thing compared to ammunition and food, but for soldiers living underground in constant stress, cigarettes were currency. They were comfort. They were the small ritual that made each day bearable. And when the stockpile ran out, Major Yamamoto faced a command decision. He could enforce strict rationing and deal with the morale problems that would create, or he could send a resupply team to retrieve cached supplies from a secondary location 3 miles away. He chose resupply. It was a calculated risk. The team would move at night. They would use a route that avoided known patrol areas. They would be back before dawn. The team left on February 28th at 2100 hours. 8 men, carrying empty packs, moving through the jungle in complete darkness. They reached the cache without incident. The cache was exactly where it was supposed to be, buried in a location that had been prepared months earlier. They dug it up, loaded the supplies, and began the return journey. They were 200 yards from Supply Point 7 when they ran into Chen's patrol. Chen wasn't supposed to be there. His patrol wasn't scheduled for that night. But Battalion had received intelligence that Japanese forces were moving supplies at night in preparation for a counterattack. Every unit had been ordered to increase night patrols. So Chen and 12 Marines were moving through the jungle at 23:30 hours on February 28th, moving slowly and quietly, when Corporal Martinez, walking point, heard something that didn't belong. Footsteps, multiple people, moving quickly through undergrowth. Martinez dropped to one knee and signaled back. Chen moved forward, listening. The sound was clear now. People moving, not trying to be quiet, moving like they had somewhere to be and weren't worried about being heard. Chen made a split-second decision. Ambush. His Marines spread out in a rough line, weapons ready, safeties off, waiting. The Japanese resupply team walked directly into them. The firefight lasted maybe 20 seconds. The Japanese were carrying supplies, not in fighting formation. The Marines had surprise and position. It was over before it really began. 6 Japanese soldiers died in that jungle trail. 2 were captured, wounded but alive. The Marines took 1 casualty, a corporal who caught a rifle bullet in his shoulder and would recover. But more importantly, the Marines captured the supplies, and those supplies told a story. Cigarettes, medical supplies, rice, all packaged in a way that indicated they had been cached, buried for long-term storage. This wasn't material being carried from one position to another. This was material being retrieved from a depot. Chen called it in immediately. Within 30 minutes, battalion intelligence officers were on the scene. Within an hour, they had interrogated the 2 prisoners. One of them talked, not because he wanted to, because he was in shock and bleeding, and the morphine made him say things he wouldn't have said otherwise. He talked about Supply Point 7. He talked about the tunnels. He talked about 260 men living underground, 400 yards from where Chen was standing. Battalion went into high alert. If the intelligence was accurate, this changed everything. An underground installation of that size, that close to the beachhead, was a strategic threat. It needed to be located, isolated, and eliminated. The problem was finding it. The wounded prisoner could describe the interior. He could talk about the layout, the number of chambers, the defensive positions, but he couldn't give them map coordinates. He knew how to get there from the cache site. He didn't know where it was in relation to American positions. So they backtracked the Japanese resupply team's route. Combat engineers and scouts working together, moving slowly, looking for any indication of where the team had come from. It took 6 hours of painstaking work in darkness and rain, but at 05:15 on March the 1st, they found it. Or rather, they found one of the ventilation shafts. A combat engineer named Sergeant Frank Morrison literally stepped on it. His boot broke through the concealed cover, and suddenly there was a hole in the jungle floor that shouldn't exist. Morrison knelt down and felt air moving, warm air rising from underground. He called Chen over. Chen looked down into the shaft. It went down at least 20 feet before it bent. They could hear something, voices, faint, coming from somewhere below. They had found Supply Point 7. The assault was planned for March 2nd at 0600 hours. 2 companies of Marines, engineers with demolitions, flamethrower teams, artillery on standby. The plan was to seal every ventilation shaft, then offer surrender. If the Japanese refused, they would pump tear gas into the shafts and wait them out. Major Yamamoto was not a stupid man. He knew that once the Americans found one ventilation shaft, they would find the others. He knew that his facility, which had remained hidden for 5 months, was now compromised beyond recovery. He had 3 options: fight from the tunnels and die slowly, surrender, or evacuate and scatter into the jungle. He chose evacuation. At 0400 hours on March the 2nd, 2 hours before the American assault was scheduled to begin, Yamamoto ordered his men to abandon Supply Point 7. They took what they could carry. They destroyed what they couldn't. They filed out through the main entrance in small groups, moving in different directions, melting into the jungle. When the Marines assaulted the facility at 0600 hours, they found it mostly empty. 15 Japanese soldiers had chosen to stay behind, either because they were too sick to travel, or because they believed their duty required them to defend the position. They fired on the Marines from defensive positions inside the tunnels. The firefight lasted 40 minutes. All 15 died. The Marines spent 3 days clearing and documenting Supply Point 7. What they found astonished them: the scale of the installation, the sophistication of the construction, the amount of supplies that had been stored there. Intelligence estimated that the facility had supported Japanese operations across southern Bougainville for 5 months. 5 months during which American patrols had walked past it 48 times. The after-action reports were extensive. How had such a large installation remained undetected for so long? What lessons could be learned? How could this be prevented in future operations? The answers were both simple and complicated. The Japanese had been better at concealment than the Americans had been at detection. The jungle had favored the defender, and perhaps most importantly, American forces had been looking for the wrong things. They had been looking for surface bunkers, for visible fortifications, for the kind of positions they had encountered on other islands. They hadn't been looking for underground installations because they hadn't fully understood how far the Japanese had taken this tactic. Captain Chen was commended for his patrol work and his actions during the firefight that led to the discovery. But he spent the rest of his time on Bougainville thinking about how many times he had walked past that installation without knowing it. How many times he had been watched by enemy soldiers he couldn't see. How many times he had reported negative contact while standing a few hundred feet from 260 Japanese troops. It was, he would later say, the most unsettling feeling of his military career. Not the combat, not the fear, the realization that the enemy had been there all along, close enough to hear, close enough to touch, and he had never known it. The Marines learned from Supply Point 7. They changed their patrol tactics. They started looking for ventilation shafts, for subtle signs of underground activity. Combat engineers were integrated more closely with reconnaissance patrols. They began using sound detection equipment to listen for underground voices or machinery. And they found more installations. Bougainville alone, they eventually located 23 separate underground facilities. Some were as large as Supply Point 7, others were smaller, just a few chambers. But all of them had been there, hidden, waiting. The war in the Pacific would continue for another 1.5 years after Supply Point 7 was discovered. The Japanese would build more underground installations on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, on dozens of smaller islands. They would refine their techniques even further, but they would never again achieve the same level of success they had on Bougainville in those 5 months. Because the Americans were looking for them now. The Americans knew what to look for. And once you know your enemy is underground, once you understand that what looks like jungle might be concealing an entire battalion, you patrol differently. You investigate differently. You fight differently. Corporal Martinez, the Marine who had found that first cigarette butt, survived the war. He returned to Texas and rarely spoke about his time on Bougainville. But when he did, he would tell people about the patrol that walked past 260 Japanese soldiers for 4 months. He would describe the feeling of learning that every time he had walked that trail, enemy eyes had been watching him from positions he couldn't see. And he would end the story by saying something that captured the essential truth of jungle warfare in the Pacific. In the jungle, the enemy isn't where you expect them to be. They're where you've already looked and decided they weren't. And the only way to find them is to keep looking. To never assume that empty jungle is actually empty, and to understand that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you walk past every day without knowing they're there. The records of Supply Point 7 sit in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The after-action reports, the intelligence summaries, the photographs taken by Marine combat photographers of the facility after it was captured, the main entrance, the storage chambers, the barracks carved into volcanic rock, evidence of one of the most successful concealment operations of World War II, and evidence that sometimes, in war, the patrol that finds nothing is walking right past everything. Major Takeshi Yamamoto survived the war. He evaded capture after evacuating Supply Point 7 and eventually surrendered in September of 1945 after Japan's capitulation. He was interviewed extensively by American military intelligence about Japanese underground warfare tactics. His testimony contributed to training materials that would be used by American forces in Korea and Vietnam. When asked how he felt about Supply Point 7's eventual discovery, he responded that he was surprised it had remained hidden as long as it did. He had expected American patrols to find the ventilation shafts within weeks. The fact that it took 5 months, he said, was a testament to how effective camouflage could be when properly executed. But he also said something else. He said that no concealment lasts forever, that eventually some small mistake, some oversight, some piece of carelessness will create the thread that unravels the whole deception. In the case of Supply Point 7, that thread was cigarettes, the human need for small comforts in impossible circumstances. War is often decided by such small things. The story of Captain Chen's patrol and Supply Point 7 is not unique. Similar incidents occurred throughout the Pacific theater. On Peleliu, American Marines fought for weeks to secure an island, while Japanese forces watched from concealed positions in the Umurbrogol Mountains. On Iwo Jima, the entire island was honeycombed with tunnels that allowed Japanese forces to appear behind American lines repeatedly. But Bougainville was where American forces first fully understood the scale and sophistication of Japanese underground warfare. It was where they learned that the jungle could hide not just individual soldiers, but entire battalions, complete installations, complex networks that defied aerial reconnaissance and ground patrols alike. The lessons learned there shaped how American forces approached every subsequent Pacific campaign. They shaped doctrine that extends to this day. the understanding that your enemy might be beneath your feet, watching, waiting, and that the patrol that finds nothing might be walking past everything. This story matters because it reminds us that warfare is not always about the grand battles, the decisive engagements that change the course of history in an afternoon. Sometimes warfare is about patience, about concealment, about the daily routine of patrols that find nothing day after day, until suddenly they find everything. It matters because it illustrates the human dimension of combat. The Japanese soldiers living underground for 5 months, dealing with claustrophobia and darkness and the constant fear of discovery. The American Marines walking the same patrol route again and again, never knowing that enemy eyes were watching them from 400 yards away. The commanders on both sides making decisions based on incomplete information, trying to anticipate what their opponent would do next. And it matters because it's a reminder that in war, as in life, things are not always what they appear to be. That empty jungle might not be empty. That quiet sector might not be quiet. That patrol route you've walked 48 times without incident might be taking you past an entire enemy battalion that you've never seen. The men who fought on Bougainville, both American and Japanese, dealt with a level of uncertainty and psychological stress that's difficult to imagine. Not knowing where the enemy was, not knowing if you were being watched, not knowing if the ground beneath your feet was solid earth or the roof of an enemy tunnel. They persevered, they adapted, they learned, and, eventually, they prevailed. But the cost in lives, in time, in resources, was steep, and the lessons came hard, learned through experience rather than preparation. Today, the jungle has reclaimed Bougainville. The tunnels of Supply Point 7 have partially collapsed. The ventilation shafts are filled with debris. The trails where Captain Chen led his patrols have disappeared beneath new growth. Nature has erased the physical evidence of that brief, violent period when thousands of men tried to kill each other on a remote island most people had never heard of. But the story remains, preserved in records, in after-action reports, in the memories of veterans who returned home and tried to explain to families what the war had been like, what it felt like to walk past an enemy you couldn't see, what it felt like to be watched without knowing it, what it felt like to learn that your routine patrol had been taking you within a few hundred feet of a strategic target for months. This is the story of a patrol that walked past the enemy for months. Not because they weren't looking, not because they weren't trying, but because their enemy had become so skilled at concealment that even the best efforts of trained reconnaissance Marines couldn't detect them until a single mistake. A decision to resupply cigarettes unraveled the entire deception. It's a story about the limits of technology and the importance of human intelligence, about how small details, a cigarette butt, a broken branch, can be the thread that solves a mystery that has confounded commanders for months. About how war is often decided not by the big battles, but by the small moments when one side makes a mistake and the other side notices it. And it's a story about the Marines who walked those patrols, who did their duty day after day, who faced an enemy they couldn't see, and who ultimately, through persistence and a bit of luck, found what they were looking for. Thank you for listening to this story from World War II. If you found this account meaningful, I ask you to subscribe to our channel, Override War, where we bring you these detailed, researched stories of real people facing impossible circumstances during history's greatest conflict. Please take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're listening from and when you heard this story. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, or somewhere else in the world? Your engagement helps us reach more people who care about preserving these historical accounts. And if there are specific stories or events from World War II you'd like us to research and share, please let us know in the comments. We're here to tell the stories that might otherwise be forgotten. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories of patience and persistence. Stories that remind us that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by soldiers walking patrol routes through jungle rain, never knowing that they're walking past the enemy who watches them from the darkness. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for helping us remember.